So, Assalamu alaikum, adab arze, hello, good afternoon, good morning to everyone who has kindly joined us today for this eighth AIMF webinar. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I speak to you today from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay respects to their elders and families past and present and emerging. And I would also like to acknowledge too the ongoing existence of their laws. This, I think, acknowledgement I frequently give, and I would want to just give some account of it to people who are not familiar with this. This is acknowledgement of country, and it's basically acknowledgement of place where I am. On the map, it would show I am in Coburg, Melbourne, but the map at times hides other histories, longer histories of this city or this place that is now in some maps called Melbourne. And that, in a way, I feel connects to the theme of our talk today and the book that we will be hearing about with its author. So my name is Adil Hassan Khan. I am a legal scholar based at the Melbourne Law School. Before proceeding further with the program today, very exciting program, I wanted to attend to some basic housekeeping. So first, I wanted to give everyone a sense of the program that we will be following. So first, we will have Zuhair Bhai giving everyone an introduction to the AIMF. Then we have Harun Bhai giving introduction and welcome to our fantastic speaker for today. Then our speaker, Ms. Taran N, will be saying a few words, reading out excerpts from a book, which this is a book talk about. I'll be chairing the discussion. I have a few questions for our speaker today to sort of get us going. And hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion afterwards, and then a vote of thanks by Ayubi Bhai. One thing I wanted to sort of add to that is that we, in terms of the discussion, please share any questions that you have during the talk, after the talk, with me in the chat. I will read them out. In case there's some clarification required, we'll sort of ask you to unmute yourself and ask the questions in person. But yeah, so just remember to share the questions with us in the chat. Okay, thank you so much, Zuhair Bhai.
Thank you so much, Adil Bhai, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Zuhair, Mohammad Zuhair. I'm a PhD candidate at Monash University based in Australia. So I would like to briefly provide you a background about who we are and what are we doing through this initiative. So basically, we are a team of academics and activists based in Australia. And Australia-India Muslim Forum is a political knowledge building and awareness raising community initiative. From this initiative, we are interested to cultivate a progressive Muslim community in diaspora, one which is politically aware of the topics that deeply affect Muslims. We plan to organize monthly webinar talks and discussions by academics, student leaders, grassroots intellectuals, and social movement figures. So with these educative webinars, we are trying to raise the awareness of and to develop a critical discourse by Muslims from Indian origin in Australia, and relatedly through them the wider public sphere in Australia regarding the operations and effects of global Islamophobia, Hindutva, and settler colonialism, as well as about the rich and positive histories, trainings and resources of the Indo-Islamic traditions that are valuable resources in the broader progressive struggle against these forces of exclusion, hate and division, as well as in creating sites of plural coexistence. You can check out our YouTube channel to watch talks and webinars we previously organized around these topics. So that's it. Now I would request Dr. Harun Qasim Bhai to introduce our speaker. Dr. Harun is a Sydney-based hospitalist. He is also an activist and the founder of the Humanism Project, an organization that continuously raises human rights violation issues on an international level. Harun Bhai, thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks very much for that, Zuhair Bhai. So it is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Taran N. Khan for the talk today. Taran is an award-winning journalist and a writer based in Mumbai. She grew up in Aligarh and was educated in Delhi and London. Her work has appeared in publications including Guernica, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and Caravan. She has received fellowships from McDonald International Artist Residency, the Jan Michalowski Foundation for Writing and Literature, the Logan Nonfiction Program, and the Swiss Arts Council Pro Helvetia. From 2006, after the fall of the Taliban regime, to 2013, Ms. Khan spent long periods living and working in Kabul. Her first book, Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul, which is the focus of a book talk today, emerges out of this experience and was published by Penguin Random House in India and the UK, Chatto and Windus in 2019, and received the Stanford Dolman Travel Book of the Year Award and the Tata Literature Live First Book Award. Over to Ms. Khan. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here in this forum and to talk about my book with some old friends here. And nice to see a group that is, far and away interested in talking about the situation with me here in Mumbai. I'll just start by telling you a little bit about the book. It's called Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul. It's based on my time in Kabul from 2006 to 13. And the first time I went to Kabul was in the spring of 2006 with my husband and another friend. And we were working there to collaborate with Afghan film producers, media producers, and we spent a few months there initially. And we really loved the place. We found very interesting people there. We found a lot of very interesting energy. And over the next few years, we kept trying to find ways to go back. And each trip was, in some way, to work with this industry of filmmakers or journalists or radio producers. And my last visit was in 2013. So that's the arc of the book, which is basically 4 years after the Taliban was overthrown from power. 5 years, sorry. And 2013 was when, if you recall, the formal end of the ISAF combat mission in Afghanistan. 2014 was supposed to be that year. And I was there last in 2013. So that is the ending of the book. Of course, events have moved a whole circle since then. And I think for me, it's interesting now to see how this book is in a way, it's a way of remembering the city. And I think it's important to hold on to that thought while we have this discussion, because one of the very strange things about Kabul is that it shifts very quickly in media narratives and in popular perception. And there is so much, suddenly there is so much about it. And there is so much written about it, there is so much said about it. It seems to be a place that we all kind of know because there's so much sudden information coming our way. And what I found is that this doesn't necessarily mean that it's a well understood place. So this is a dichotomy that keeps happening to Kabul. And I will talk about Kabul because that's the city I know best. Of course, Afghanistan as an entity is much larger, far more complex. So my whatever I say is about the city where I spent time. I'll just read a little bit from the beginning, and that will maybe give you a little bit of the idea of what the frame of the book and the approach it takes to this place. This is from chapter 1 called Returns. Stories in Kabul begin with the phrase, Yeki Bood, Yeki Nabood. There was one, there was no one. The phrase corresponds to the once upon a time of fairy tales elsewhere. Whichever way you choose to read this expression, it is a good place to begin the story of Kabul, a city that was and never was. Or to use the trick of fables, There it is, there it is not. The story of Kabul begins with bridges, roads appearing on water. In one legend about its origin, it appeared as a magic island in the middle of a large lake. To reach the island, a king built a bridge or a pull made of straw or ka. The combination of the two words that created this bridge, ka and pull, gave the city he made on this magic isle its name. Kabul is an island, or so it appears to the outsider standing on one of its nondescript pothole streets. It deceives you with its high walls streaked with brown mud, punctuated by steel-topped gates. It hides behind the fine mist of dust that hangs over its streets and homes, so that the city appears as though from the other side of a soft curtain, like a mirage, a place that is both near and far away. But walk through the small opening in an entrance gate and everything changes. You enter lush gardens and beautiful homes. Their rooms filled with books, carpets, photographs, and music. In the older quarters of the city, the flat mud roofs of tightly packed homes form a different kind of thoroughfare, an elevated path across secluded spaces that is protected from the public gaze. Elsewhere, there appear landscapes of homes clinging to the hills, their windows half reflecting the sky, half revealing glimpses of life in the rooms within. The city appears with a shift in perspective. As a child, I was fascinated by a tiny kaleidoscope my father bought me. It was a plastic tube with a transparent cap at the end, filled with pieces of broken bangles, colored glass of different sizes. I was riveted by this transformation of everyday objects into the fragments of a magical landscape, and I was drawn to how a simple shift of my wrist or even of my eye would make the pieces rearrange themselves into a new picture. Walking in Kabul is like looking through the kaleidoscope. Fragments fall into place. The familiar appears new. There it is not. Kabul appears where you don't expect to see it. So I'll stop there. It's extremely poignant to be reading this at this point in history, but I hope this is a good place to start talking about the book and about anything else.
Thank you so much, Taranapa. I am struck by if those who haven't read this book, I would highly recommend getting a copy and reading it, or even if you're into the audiobooks, listening to the audiobooks, because it's really one of those books I couldn't put down. It was a book, as I was reading, that is about memory, and it evoked a lot of memories for me of I've never been to Kabul, but I guess one has memories of cities one hasn't been to as well, which is both a good thing and something one needs to be a bit careful of as well. So one of the things I wanted to sort of bring up in terms of to start us off on a discussion was, and connecting it to some of the ways we sort of as a group have been also thought about this talk, and you mentioned that about the news cycles and how Kabul appears in these news cycles as a place that one associates with a crisis and with events, really, with sharp, short events. And one of the things one thought was, okay, this is a time to have a talk on on Afghanistan, on Kabul. And then in a couple of weeks, of course, that has moved on. We have moved on to a new trauma, a new event. Something else has happened somewhere. And that, in a way, also connects to the way it's brought up in news cycles, where each news cycle forgets about these news cycle that had taken place, not just 10 years before, not just in 2001, not in 2006, not in 1998, not in 1977, but forgets what had happened 3 weeks ago in that very publication, perhaps. So each time we start afresh, each time we get told about the present disaster. So this event of this aspect of amnesia in the reporting is something that I think I'm really struck by, and I think a lot of us are struck by, and there's been some writing on that. But I want you to I was really struck by how you describe Kabul itself as an amnesiac city. So it would be wonderful to hear more about what you mean by that, and give us a bit of a sense of why and what that means for you.
Sure. Yeah. The term amnesiac city was not my own formulation, but something I came across while reading a history of Kabul. And it seemed extremely apt to me. And I thought it seemed to sum up so much of what I felt about Kabul. Again, remember that this is the time from 2006 to 13, where, in hindsight, there's this, I think, an urge or a tendency to even romanticize even this time, which was a very difficult time in Kabul. I mean, it would be foolish to forget that, I think, because like I said in the book, 2006, when I arrived there was a period of cusp when the initial hopefulness of right after 2001 was already beginning to fade, but it wasn't such a dire security situation as it ended up becoming by the time I had left. So I think it was interesting for me to find this phrase, because when I got there, my entire or the majority of my frame of reference was really what I had read from the Western media, because Indian newspapers didn't have so many reporters on the ground, and we didn't really have a large Indian lens fixed to this place other than through strategy phase. And I think that is very much currently the case still. We tend to focus on this place as a place of strategy, as a place of geopolitics. But part of the reason I felt like writing this book was because I couldn't really find something that spoke about the other ways of connecting to Kabul as an Indian woman. But to get back to the point of the amnesiac city, it seemed to be a place that was quite, marked by the immediate past few years of conflict. But the idea that this is a city that has a much deeper history, and that that history was very different from the apparent history of the city, that took me a long, good while to get to. And I think part of the reason I could get there was that if you read the book, one of the main characters is my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who, like Adil mentioned, had memories of a city he had never been to. He had never been to Kabul, but he knew it really in a very intimate way, which was through reading, through poetry, through mythology. He was connected to this really intangible but very, very interesting arc that kind of spanned from where he lived to Afghanistan to Kabul. And I would go there to Kabul, and I would sort of learn things about it. And one of the great good fortunes I had was that almost from the first day onwards, I was in the company of people who were incredibly generous Afghans, and they just took me to places, and they let me into their lives in this really lovely way, I think, which I can never be sufficiently grateful for, because it just allowed me to see the side of the city, which was so intimate, so everyday, so banal, that was a revelation. I didn't think of Kabul as a city marked by banality, and where weekends have a rhythm and the seasons changing is this definite sort of thing. And I was also fortunate enough not to have to live inside a compound like many people more later on than in 2006, but people coming from abroad ended up living fairly sequestered lives, not always of their own choosing. But I was really lucky in that I could explore the city in this freer way. And I could also listen to people talk about it. And they just described it to me in this range of ways, which was such a revelation and so freeing of the kind of very, boxed in views that I had of Kabul. And I'm talking about myself because I think it would be foolish not to implicate myself in buying into these narratives and accepting them. So I think often we say, oh, we tend to do this. But when I say we, I think it's important to say, I mean I, when I say that. So this is very much my journey through understanding Kabul. And in my case, I had this wonderful guide who was my grandfather, my Nana. And he would tell me things when I would come back from Kabul about the city. And I would say, well, okay, I didn't know that. And I would go back to Kabul and I would, figure this out, talk to people, ask friends about it. And sure enough, that would reveal a whole new layer to this place. And so it became like this beautiful bridge that was built from Aligarh, where my grandfather lived, to Kabul, which was made purely of stories and writing and poetry and myths and memories. And this allowed me also, because I grew up in Aligarh, that I think some people here would know well, but my experience was very much of inhabiting interiors. As a girl, as a young woman, I was very, very fluent in navigating, hours spent indoors. I think for that reason, I was also very open to seeing this as a way of exploring Kabul, of just as progressively times got harder and harder, and being able to venture out became difficult in terms of security. You couldn't just sort of walk out for a walk. I had to have a reason, or there had to be a sort of decision on why and where. It became also viable, I think, to me, to see the idea of wandering through the memories of Kabulis, their stories like what my grandfather told me. I was open to seeing these as a very valid form of exploration and understanding the city. I think all of this together helped me see this place as the amnesiac city, which isn't to say that everything is forgotten or lost, but it's obscured behind the surface. And in Kabul's case, the past 40 years when I was there, the past 40-something years of war was so dominant, they were so evident, they were so looming in every discourse that, of course, they tended to be the very first thing you encountered. And to drill past that, I think, was the journey that I took in all the time I spent there. And that's really what the book is a result of, was the realization that there's so much more to the city than what I had known as a journalist living and working in India. And also how mixed up everything is. It's such a diverse city. There's so many histories below the surface. There were so many stories that were complicated. And when I read the narratives of how Kabul was saved and how things were dreadful and then they became okay, kind of very easy narratives, they were extremely complicated once you scratch the surface. So in this sense, I thought the idea of this place as an amnesiac city was a useful phrase to encompass these many, many ideas that were coming up.
Well, thank you. I was one of the things I'm struck by in this book, which I really loved, is how poetry, especially Persian poetry, not only do you start off with the beautiful sort of lines from Saadi's Gulistan, but in a way it is the lens through which you, in a way it is the compass of Persian poetry that you take with you on this journey. And that I think I'd love for you to offer some sort of hear more about this and tell people, because there's a lot there which it would be good for the audience to sort of get us. It's beautifully sort of weaved together through this lens, and there I think again it really the juxtaposition of that with this sort of other travel literature, which has become big, sort of the sort of Lonely Planet kind of a thing, but also the kind of travel literature which is associated with NGOs and humanitarian workers who visit in a particular way, but also and I think and I'll sort of won't add too much to that, but the one thing it struck me with was there's something about there's this some literature coming out on the Persianate world. It was sort of that. So I'm thinking of Richard Eaton's work and Manakia's recent work on the Persianate world, Hindustan before India, which was not organized in terms of territory and ethnicity, that you are born in a particular ethnicity and race in certain senses, but in terms of place and literature. So you Persian is who is versed in Persian literature and poetry. So you can, you are Persian not because of some notion of ethnicity. So I think that sort of is something that came across in this for me. But it would be great to hear about your reflections on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought, Adil. I mean, I suppose it's not something I fully developed in this book, because my reference point was very much my grandfather. I'm not fluent in Persian at all. So my understanding of Kabul was very much through the English canon. And that included, all the sort of well-known writers from Western centers of power, as well as other more diverse sources. But predominantly, that was my understanding where it was coming from. Whereas for my grandfather, it was just so much bigger and freer, and it was more intuitive. It was far more everyday kind of relationship that I was very drawn to. And I think I'll just give you one example. Is like in the Shahnama, which is like this epic that, as you say, belongs to everyone. It far transcends any kind of national boundaries or any kind of territorial claims. I think it's a treasure for humanity, certainly. And in that epic, there is this character called Rudaba, who is a princess of Kabul, and she is the mother of the wife of Zal, and the mother of Rustam. And this is something I learned from my grandfather, that she was living in Kabul, and Kabul is actually present in these scenes in the Shahnama. And reading about this, again, was just something that changed the city for me in many ways. One was to see it. I didn't see Kabul as a place of production of poetry or literature or beauty, even appreciation of beauty. Of course, that was completely false. I mean, the appreciation for poetry and for any kind of beauty is so marked. And like I said in my book, that you could sort of just go on and on talking to people in Kabul, and they would just end the argument by saying, no, but that's what the poet said. And that would be it. That would be the end of the argument, because you can't argue with the poet. So this was a shift for me, to be able to see this place as a place which was not only a place from which poetry came forth, but it was part of the map of literature in this very real way as well, in a historical way as well. So it located it within the template of literature that I was familiar with. It didn't seem so far away then, because constantly through the years I would come and go to Afghanistan. One of the most frequent questions I would be asked was, what is it like there? And in that tone and the way in which that there was pronounced, it felt like it was a city with which we could have no connection. It was extremely far away, not in physical terms, but in conceptual terms, in emotional terms. And I think a large part of the effort or the idea why I was drawn to writing a book was to see how quickly this fell away once I learned these things. And for me, definitely learning about the connections through poetry was a big part of this. I think, again, if I hadn't had my grandfather to guide me, it would have been more difficult for me to have found this way, or at least have found it in such an intriguing way. But of course it exists, like there's a passage in my book where I passed through these two parks called Bustan and Gulistan, and suddenly the penny dropped that, oh, okay, well, these aren't just random names. I mean, this is poetry engraved on the streets of the city, and it's part of the whole Persian canon. It's beautiful, how deeply it's entwined into the very life of the city. There are streets named after poets. There are there's celebrations of poetry. There are memories of poetry everywhere. So it wasn't alien at all, but it took a shift from me to see it in that way. I think that's the important thing to realize, is that it's not like I discovered this completely new side of Kabul, not at all. And I think that links to your question of the writing of travel. Again, for me, this was when I started writing about the city, I wasn't in my mind writing travel narratives. I started by writing longer pieces about the city, but I was very frustrated by the format of news writing, feature writing even, because that demanded a certain shorthand, that demanded a certain sort of way, a frame to see the city through, which I think reduced it in many ways. And that was my constant collision with this idea of presenting Kabul. I felt like all the interesting stuff, the really fantastic material that I was finding, or just the really interesting details of my life there was no space to put them in these stories. So of course, then I had to find a different space to put those stories, and that space was the book. But even within a book, what is the form that you end up choosing? That's a very important, and I think a very it's a decision informed by politics, by location, by history. Also, all this in hindsight. At the moment, I just wanted to finish the book, but I think for me, the decision was very important that it wouldn't be a book of memoir, because I was not at the center of this book. I think there have been enough books about journalists in war zones, and I didn't see how writing about Kabul through my own experience would illuminate it in any different way. So I was quite clear that this had to be a story about the city, and I could only be a lens through which to see it. Interestingly, once I started writing it, and as we talked about, it's a very deeply engraved territory. There's this huge history of writing, mostly by men, mostly from the Western traditional centers of power. And I thought, I mean, I was finding things that were completely different. That's what was interesting me. That's where I was drawn to. The stories that I found intriguing didn't necessarily fit into these molds of narrative journalism or even travel writing about Kabul. That was a process that I had to go through, and I think I talk about it now because I think it's interesting to recognize it as an awareness of how to write about spaces from non-Western perspectives. And I had to see myself, my own history, my own experiences as an Indian woman, not as a liability, but as an asset, as something that would allow me to explore spaces and ideas in a different way. And I think the part where the penny dropped is when I could realize that what I was seeing and what I was writing about were absolutely stories worth writing about. The idea of a story being worthy of being told is a very loaded one. And I think as an Indian woman writing about the space, that was an important realization for me to come to. And I'm sharing this, like I said, because I think it's an important point in discourse to recognize this. In hindsight, this is a book that combines many genres. I think it's travel. If there is memoir, for sure, there is history, there's I think psychogeography, there's poetry, as you said. And the reason why I didn't want, or why it ended up being so many things, is because I wanted to be able to accommodate the multiplicity of the city and the many ways of being able to see it, which is not to say that I intended it only for readers or for people who live in India to be able to connect with it, not at all, because I think in this way of seeing there is, it's foolish to think that this cannot be a wider way of seeing the city. It's definitely not restrained by geography or by your own experience. Why not? Why wouldn't someone who's grown up in the West be interested in seeing Kabul this way? For me, it was important to have this kind of free structure because I wanted readers to engage with it with their own imagination. I didn't want to be prescriptive. I wanted it to be a story of exploration, of wandering off, of not sometimes getting lost. I think there's a tremendous richness in the idea of getting lost, because it frees the reader from the sort of narrative voice which is telling him or her what to think. And I wanted them to be able to, like you said, which made me really happy, that you could imagine it as a city that you knew. That was really it. That was the point. Because when we do that, we see Kabul as a place of humanity, as a place with people like ourselves. And once you see that, it's different to see what's going on there. I think that's really important. If you strip a city of its humanity, if you strip it of any form of connection with yourself, then the violence or the oppression is different to watch than when it seems to be a city that you could know.
Thank you. That is really beautifully put. We started getting questions from the audience as well, but I'll sort of ask a further few questions and then we'll sort of dip into those questions. I think there's what I really, another point I really, and connected to what you just said, really found fascinating and enlightening in this book was the balance you maintain between that sense of the familiar as well as a sense of difference, that it is doesn't sort of, you don't collapse Kabul into Aligarh or into, you know, your to have to live up to your expectations of it. And that in a way brings that sense of humanity, but it does not become a humanity without an empathy for the difference that's there. I'm reminded of a story from my life. I went to a wedding once when I was a child. It was sort of an Indian Muslim man getting married, and his wife, the person he was getting married to was a lady from Kabul. So everyone, initially the wedding seemed very familiar. Everyone was like, oh, same things happening. And then the nikah was the ceremony started off. And when the celebrant asked the lady whether she agreed to get married, she did not respond, but her mum said she's gone for a walk. At which point the Indian side of the family was in complete shock as to what. Then the next time they were asked, she said no. So the celebrant almost had a heart attack, and the third time she said yes. So it turned out that was a custom that their sort of family and it was broadly shared. But I was struck by, even as a child, the sense of disgust that evinced amongst people who thought, oh, I thought these people were just like us. These are not proper Muslims or something like that was so I think that sort of danger of, we have certain expectations of those who we think are same to us. And then when we reach out to them in situations of hospitality or of help or of advocacy, we are struck by the fact that they are a bit different, and therefore we actually back away. So that sense of a rich sense of humanity is something I feel your book really brings out. And if you could sort of talk a bit about that sort of how that sense of the unfamiliar played out in your narrative and in your experiences of going there and going back each time you come back to a different city in a lot of ways.
It's a really interesting question, and it's interesting to think about it now in this way of the unfamiliar juxtaposed with the familiar, because of course that is very much the experience of Kabul for me. A sort of a part insider, part outsider, but someone who, I think for me the key was really just going there with a sense of happiness. You know, the first time I went there, I was really happy to go there. And I think in hindsight, that seems to have been the starting point for many relationships, because there's one way of going there, which is sort of, oh, I'm going to a war zone. What are things going to be like? And I'm not saying that I went, sort of unaware of all this history, but at the heart of it was a strong keenness to connect with the city. And I think that cemented many bonds for me over the years, and they very much endure till now. But of course, the city was changing every time I went back. So I was going back every time to continuity in the sense of relationships, of friends, of even spaces that I would inhabit, the work I did. But there was also every time elements of, in many cases, very jarring changes. So from about 2009 onwards, as the security situation started becoming more and more fragile, what happened was that the Afghan government, as well as the international community, started withdrawing behind these security barricades, behind these tall blast walls that I think were, even in the photographs that we see now, these walls are everywhere. it wasn't the case. Initially they came up during the period of my acquaintance with Kabul. And the geography of the city changed in this way. It became sort of marked by by checkpoints, by security barriers, more and more and more, and encroaching onto the city in a very prominent way. So if I had used to walk down a certain street and then suddenly half that street is gone because there's now a huge concrete barrier and everything behind us is now closed off to the public. Many streets were actually closed off for security. So you could sort of just forget that they existed actually because no one could go there. And I wrote about one of these in my book in the chapter on film and cinema. The whole, again, because of the population influx into Kabul, it pushed beyond its traditional boundaries. It grew beyond the mountains. It went, there were new kinds of colonies being built, which were more modern, which had residences for modern Afghan families, and they had security guards at the gate and so on. So there was a lot changing within the city. And it was also changing in the sense that for friends or for people I worked with, and this is 2013, again, remember that people who had spent their whole lives as refugees abroad managed to find a plot of land and build a house there, for instance. And they were obviously extremely happy with that, with the idea of being able to come home in this very real way. So there was all of that as well. And, all of this was again in a way familiar because, like small towns in India are changing all the time. And, old houses are vanishing. There are multi-stories coming up and real estate prices are going up. And everyone has a sort of familiar lament that, now we can't really find a way around anymore. Everything's changed. There's a new flyover in Delhi or Mumbai. So in that sense, this wasn't anything unusual. But in Kabul, it was very, very marked because it existed against this layer of insecurity, of being constantly aware of the threats around you, not only from insurgents or from terrorists, but also crime and just, the high levels of kidnapping and so on that had started happening in Kabul even by 2013. So it was never an idea for me to overstress the familiarity in that sense, only in the sense that all cities are the same. That is the way Kabul is the same. But of course, like all cities, it just completely has its own rhythm. And at that time, it had its own form of change, which is what I remarked on. The fact that understanding that this is a city that is not static was a large part of the learning that I had to undertake as well, because often it becomes frozen. It became frozen in my mind as a city of perennial war, perennial suffering. And what happens when that happens is that the suffering seems preordained, it seems quite inevitable. And I think that's what a lot of the narratives of recycling stories of the graveyard of empires and that kind of keep talking about colonial era battles, they do that, they tend to make it seem like this is the only way the story would have ended. And I don't think that's true. I think that's a damaging myth. I think there was a deep desire for peace. And, in Kabul, certainly when I saw it. And the fact that it hasn't worked out is a very complicated outcome if you can't simply put it down to the sort of inevitable churning of historical forces.
I think that's a really important point, and in a way to connect it to the sort of an aspect of the book that struck me. This is it is a very poetic book, but it's not a very romantic book. It is very poetic yet clear-sighted. And again, the juxtaposition of that would be with the kind of literature, not books, but sort of even policy literature that has come out of the US. It's almost a narrative of unrequited love, which is romance, and its sense of, oh, we really helped you out, and look what you've done to us. You've sort of turned us away. So that I think it helps us in a way avoid the binaries that come with that, of either you are the same as us or you are completely different. And the binaries that populate a lot of the discourse around it, including on, let's say, women Afghan women and their conditions under the Taliban or after the Taliban or before the Taliban, that in a way complicates that narrative from both sides. In a way, the sort of in a way, the celebrationist narrative, as well as the sort of narrative of complete sort of hopelessness. So I think that I'd be sort of really interested in hearing a bit more about how you sort of felt you managed that and the richness I felt you really brought to that, especially on, just as one of the things that struck me was while reading the text was when you talk about how as a woman you walked the city and you always had a walk with a sense of that you were going somewhere, that you were going for some work, and I think and how you did the same in Aligarh. So that in a way that nuance is missing in any sort of reporting or even academic reflections on these questions that arise out of sort of experiences like that. Not to deny again that some of these issues are there, but how does one approach them in a way, the lens through which one approaches them?
I think a really important thing we don't talk about is time, just the importance of spending time, investing time in a place. And I'm talking from the perspective of a journalist. I was never the idea of romanticizing Kabul is a bit impossible to do. If you're no, let me rephrase that. It's not impossible to do because people do it, but it was hard for me to see myself doing that simply because as a nonfiction writer, part of my work is to pass down the apparent narratives. And this was extremely interesting to do in Kabul because you ended up in a place far from where you began. And this was part of my work as a nonfiction writer, as a journalist living and working in Kabul, was to go beyond what really seemed to be the dominant way of looking at things. And the reason I could do that was because I kept going back to the city. I think and after August 15th, there are so many hot takes on Afghanistan, on Kabul, which are obviously missing a nuance. And I think part of the reason is that how on earth can you come up with something insightful within days? It's really difficult to me. I don't see how this is going to be achieved until we move beyond event-based reporting and we get into process-based reporting. This is, of course, a very large issue for the media in general. It's not just about Afghanistan. It's a far larger debate. But it is something that I think is intrinsic to the way we see Afghanistan and Kabul, is that we tend to report, as you said, already the news cycle has chugged its way beyond to something else. And that is linked to how we see this space, because we only see it at a time of crisis. We only see it at a time of something huge happening, and then it sort of vanishes again. And like you rightly pointed out, Adil, this isn't the first time that this has happened. And I'm always struck by the invisibility of the conflict during the civil war, which was before the Taliban took over in '96, and which was a time of great violence, great atrocities, a lot of crimes against women, against crimes against humanity, human rights violations in Kabul, which have been documented. But they were barely discussed in the time that I was there, certainly not among the sort of policy / media circles. But that was a time that had left this deep mark on virtually every family in Kabul at that time. It was an extremely violent period. It was a period when people had to really face unspeakable atrocities, but there was a sort of strange amnesia around it. And I was really struck by how often that popped up, because if something as simple as just walking down a street and seeing this carcass of a cinema, and I would assume that it was by the Taliban, and I would be told, no, this was during the civil war. So, which is to say that the violence has a history, and which part of the violence becomes prominent is obviously a very important part of how this place is seen. And I think for me, the key is really the reason why we are not going to be seeing the space again, or we're not going to be seeing so much nuanced analysis of the space again, is because we are not going to put in the time required to understand it from the perspective of the media, of course. I'm sorry, I forgot the rest of your question. I was so
no, that that was really, and actually in a way that connects to another sort of point that I've sort of been meaning to bring up, which is about the perspective. I mean, you do bring a sort of a unique perspective onto this, and in a way, this kind of perspective is exactly the perspective one doesn't get, not just in terms of the genre, but as, you know, as an Indian Muslim woman writing about Afghanistan. That's not something that we really, so it's the, I think what the nuance, the perspective brings is also important. I had a question sort of related to that, was post 15th August, were you asked to give a lot of hot takes as well? I'm curious. So did people have expectations that, okay, you will provide us now with some insider perspective on, so just out of curiosity.
You know, I don't think this wasn't something that I meant personally. But I was asked to write about Kabul for a few places, and I was grateful for the opportunity, because that sort of let me think through many things. And I think I was able to do that because writing is a way to obviously process what's going on, and to be able to share, you know, how the place is changing for me as well. So no, I think that wasn't a personal sort of situation. Maybe because that's just not the kind of space I inhabit as a writer, as a journalist. But I was happy to be able to, I mean, it took me a while, but I was happy to be able to get even that space. The idea of being able to write about Kabul was something that came after a little while in my personal case. I'm sure there were other people who dealt with it differently. But I needed the time to be able to sift through what was going on, and then to be able to write about it.
Yeah, and I sort of want to, in a way, also just to say how significant that a book like this is for us, a group like us, who are into sort of education and sort of at an intersection with advocacy. I think this is an eye-opener in a sense that in a lot of, and this is in a way why we think it's important to have this kind of a discourse around, and a reflection on, a critical reflection on what possibilities are there and what sort of issues we have before us in advocacy work, before we sort of jump into it, is in a sort of good meaning, well-meaning advocacy work as well. One slips into exactly these kinds of hot takes or event-based sort of responses. So it's not just governments and sort of NGOs and states, sort of the UN, but it's sort of, it is how in a way we are trained to respond to others. And I think this sort of a reflection does really help us, I feel, complicate some of those things about how one is dealing with, I mean, the humanity gets lost in trying to save humanity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I had a conversation with a colleague who had reported from Afghanistan around the same time. She'd overlapped. And we were just sharing at that point about how heartbreaking it was to see. And she said something that really stayed with me, where she said the only way to really get through this is to see this not as a short-term engagement, but for a long-term marathon. You know, it's just something that will keep going for us. We'll stay engaged with this idea long after the attention or the oxygen has moved away. So try to face yourself in that way. And of course, this was like a personal advice from a friend, but I thought it was really meaningful also as a comment on being a journalist engaged with these kind of issues, not just Afghanistan. I mean, there's just so many other issues like this, like you rightly pointed out. If you're working with advocacy, if you're writing on a certain kind of issue, you really have to understand that it's a long-term process. You can't just exhaust resources at that time of crisis where everyone is looking.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And as I'm mindful of the time, but I sort of, before we sort of end, I did want to ask you a question about what you have planned as an author in the future. What is next? Can you give us a sense of are there any plans that you sort of for books? Or
I'll let you know as soon as I find out. It's a very tricky one.
Okay, so we would really be sort of eagerly looking forward to anything else you would have sort of, and best of luck with the things to come.
Thank you, Atam. Yeah, that's really, I mean, it's always wonderful to have readers like you and to have people listening with a sense of connection. I'm really grateful. This was one part of writing the book I hadn't anticipated, was how it changes when it goes out to people, because I was so focused on finishing it. But this has been really wonderful.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us, and I'll give the thanks vote to for Yubi Bhai to give. So thank you. I'll end here. Yubi Bhai.
You are mute, Yubi Bhai.
Are you on mute?
Okay, I'm unmuted. Okay. I would like to thank Mrs. Khan for this excellent talk and the excellent book which she has written. We all see books, from I went to Switzerland, I went to this place. You look at the nice parts of it. Now, Kabul is not a place where we all would want to go, or I don't think that any one of us in this group has gone there. Saying which, it is a very historical place going back to thousands of years. So, and having read, I would confess that I haven't read the whole book, but excerpts and bits from it. And it's something which is very different from what I have read in terms of other travel logs or other books on experience of visit. Plus, most people have a fleeting experience of visiting a place. So when you said that you go and look at things from what you learned back, and then you go back and look at it from a different eye. So the amnesia which you develop, and then you develop a new memory for it, is something which really makes you live in that place in flesh and blood, So the book takes you on a journey of a different kind, which is very, very enlightening to the readers of the book. Like all good writers, and the talk and the book itself immerses as if you're not an observer, which I find, but are inside the story in the flesh and blood, which is something which is very, very nice in the way things have been written. Saying which, it is very heart-rendering from Afghanistan is our neighbor, and to see what is happening with people over there, what been a great civilization. I'd like to thank Taran and all the writers and journalists, who have put themselves in great peril, and hats off to them for the great work which they are doing, and enlightening readers and the wider population as well. So thank you very much again. Okay, looking forward to your next write-up, and looking forward to the audio version of it as well, which will be released in Australia later on in the year. I would like to let all the listeners and people who have joined us say that later in October, we are pleased to announce that we have the legal scholar giving a on the hot topic of NRC and Assam, which is again in the limelight. Thanks very much from myself. Thanks, Zohair. Thanks, Adil Bhai. And thanks, Taran, again. And thanks to all of you for joining us today, giving a valuable time to listen to this great talk.
Thank you, Yubi Bhai. You cut out at the name of the person, so I'll just say it's Aman Wadud giving a talk on NRC and Assam. Thank you so much. Everyone have a good day. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.